Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're immersing ourselves in one of the most consequential geopolitical shifts of our time.
Yeah, we really are.
And we're using a truly fascinating source as our guide for this. We're pulling from an analytical essay published in the Global Review on April 25, 2026. It's by Dr. Farid Novin, and it's titled The Wages of Incoherence.
Right, and it's a deep piece.
It really is. Our focus today is the immediate aftermath of the unprecedented February 28, 2026, direct military confrontation between the United States and Israel, who launched Operation Epic Fury, and Iran, who responded with Operation True Promise 4.
For anyone listening who has been tracking international relations, you know the era of the shadow war in the Middle East is over.
Right, totally over.
All those decades of proxy fights, the economic sanctions, and deniable quiet strikes is all officially done. This February conflict erupted into, well, the most massive direct military confrontation between Western-aligned powers and the Islamic Republic since the 1979 revolution.
Wow, yeah. And so our mission today, it isn't to just recap the news or, tally up the bomb damage. We want to use this deep dive to look at the why.
Exactly.
Dr. Novin's essay does something incredibly clever here. It applies the ancient wisdom of two foundational military strategists, Karl von Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, to decode why a conflict that everyone had anticipated for years ended up being so profoundly chaotic.
It really was chaos.
Now, I want to establish our ground rules right up front for you listening. We are impartially exploring the strategic analysis presented in this source. We aren't taking political sides here, left or right.
Right, no sides.
We are simply unpacking the objective framework Dr. Novin uses to evaluate the strategic conduct of the nations involved.
And, the lessons drawn from this analysis, they really transcend government policies. What we are examining is a masterclass in why massive resources, overwhelming technological superiority, and raw power do not automatically translate to success. That is a dynamic you can apply to corporate leadership, to navigating complex systems in your own life, and just to understanding how the modern world actually functions under extreme stress.
To really grasp that dynamic, imagine you hire a high-end demolition crew to renovate your house. They show up on day one, and without asking to see a single blueprint, they just take a sledgehammer to the load-bearing walls.
Right, just swinging blindly.
Exactly. It's loud, it's dramatic, and it feels like undeniable progress. But then the dust settles, and you realize you never actually decided if you wanted to build a new kitchen, add a second story, or just expand the living room. And now, well, the roof is caving in.
That is the dangerous illusion, right? That simply taking destructive action is the same thing as having a cohesive strategy.
Yeah.
When you apply that illusion to the geopolitical stage, the consequences are magnified exponentially.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting at the foundation of the conflict. Because if we want to understand why the roof caved in on Operation Epic Fury, we have to look at the foundational flaw Dr. Novin identifies.
The initial goals, right?
Right. Before the very first B-2 stealth bomber ever crossed into Iranian airspace, Washington's stated objectives were just a complete mess.
This is where we bring in Karl von Clausewitz, the legendary Prussian military theorist. His most famous rule is that war is merely the continuation of politics by other means.
Which sounds so simple.
It sounds like a simple truism, yeah, but it carries a massive, uncompromising requirement. Before you launch military action, you must know exactly what your political goal is. You have to know what the politics are that you are supposedly continuing.
And according to the source, the U.S. and its allies had totally competing goals. Like, you had different factions in Washington pushing for entirely different outcomes.
They weren't on the same page at all.
Not even close. Some wanted regime change, which means physically ripping out the leadership structure and collapsing the government. Others wanted nuclear rollback, which is completely different. That just means bombing centrifuges and research labs to delay a bomb.
Right.
Then you had people pushing for behavioral modification, meaning you inflict enough economic pain that they stop funding proxy groups. And finally, some just wanted deterrence containment, which basically means building a fence around them to stop them from expanding.
What's fascinating here is that each of those goals demands a completely different instrument of power, a different timeline, and a completely different definition of success.
Oh, for sure.
If your goal is nuclear rollback, you target reinforced concrete bunkers deep underground. But if your goal is regime change, you target internal security forces and societal control mechanisms. You cannot efficiently achieve all of them simultaneously with the same blunt instrument.
That contradiction was glaringly obvious just days before the strike. On February 24th, President Trump gave his State of the Union address. He claimed Iran had restarted its nuclear program and was actively developing missiles to strike the U.S.
So he's building a case for war.
Exactly. He was aggressively laying out a framing that prioritized immediate military logic. But at that exact same time, and the UK House of Commons Library confirmed this, there were indirect negotiations happening in Oman that were actually making significant progress.
While military buildup is happening.
Yes. Iran was reportedly willing to make actual concessions on their uranium enrichment.
So you have diplomatic architecture succeeding on one track, offering the regime an off-ramp, while a sudden military operation is preempting it on another track, threatening their actual survival.
It's crazy.
Clausewitz would diagnose that immediately. He'd say, you lack a single decisive political objective. You are sending completely chaotic signals.
The starkest example of this fragmented strategy was the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei during the opening salvos of the operation.
A huge moment.
Massive. But Trump simultaneously called for the overthrow of the regime, then subsequently claimed that regime change had actually occurred because of the assassination, but then announced that he completely distrusted the new Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, calling his appointment unacceptable.
See, if the overarching goal was truly regime change, why wouldn't you have a detailed plan to shape or engage with the succession crisis you just created?
Exactly.
Without a blueprint for the day after, you are just breaking things.
Yeah.
Sun Tzu is just as unforgiving about this as Clausewitz. Sun Tzu teaches that without a clearly defined end state, military action ceases to be a tool. It becomes a self-perpetuating cycle of violence.
It's like starting a massive corporate restructuring without deciding if your goal is to increase short-term profits or pivot to an entirely new product line. You fire the entire C-suite and just hope a new business model magically appears in the rubble.
This raises an important question, though. What happens when that lack of a unified plan hits the reality of the negotiating table?
Oh man, the ceasefire.
Right. We saw the immediate result in the highly publicized ceasefire brokered by Pakistan in early April. It was a diplomatic train wreck.
Total train wreck.
The U.S. brought a 15-point plan. Tehran flatly rejected it and countered with a 10-point proposal. The U.S. then gave Iran a 3 to 5 day deadline to resolve alleged internal infighting. Dr. Novin calls this exactly what it is, improvisation dressed up as strategy.
If your political goals are that fragmented, it guarantees your military execution is going to be misaligned no matter how good the tactical planning is.
Absolutely.
Let's look at how that disconnect actually played out on the ground during Operation Epic Fury. Because on paper, the opening hours sound like a flawless triumph of modern engineering.
The operational planning was undeniably sophisticated. According to Israeli IDF Brigadier General Effie Defrin, there were months of joint U.S.-Israeli strategic and operational deception.
They were playing the long game there.
They were. They manipulated satellite imagery to conceal their force readiness, lulling Iranian air defenses into a false sense of routine.
The execution was staggering to read about. They hit 3 separate gatherings of Iranian regime officials within half a minute of each other. 30 seconds.
That level of coordination is unreal. But this is the moment we transition from the pristine theory of the command room to what Clausewitz famously called the fog of war.
Right, where things get messy.
Exactly. He warned that no campaign plan survives first contact with the enemy, because the enemy of a good plan is the dream of a perfect plan. Washington and Israel dreamed of a perfect plan. They assumed that taking out the supreme leader and degrading infrastructure would cause the entire Iranian system to shatter.
Wait a second, I have to push back here.
Go for it.
Just looking at it logically, if you successfully decapitate a leadership structure, you instantly take out the man at the very top and you simultaneously degrade their missile capacity by 2/3. I mean, mathematically, shouldn't the system break down?
You would think so.
Right. If you remove the CEO and the executive board of a company on the same day, that company flounders.
You are thinking in a very linear Western corporate way, which is exactly the trap the military planners fell into. You assume strike A equals collapse B. But Sun Tzu's entire philosophy is built around adversarial adaptation.
Okay.
The reality of entrenched human systems, especially a theocracy that has survived decades of isolation, is highly nonlinear. They didn't rely on a single fragile node.
So how did they survive the decapitation? Because that was a huge blow.
Well, the regime has spent decades building deeply embedded, redundant command structures. When the top node was severed, the system didn't collapse. It simply activated the next layer of its wartime protocol.
Wow.
Alaya Larijani, immediately stepped in to govern to prevent a vacuum. Then Mujtaba Khamenei was appointed supreme leader. And even when Larijani was killed weeks later in another precision strike on March 17th, Mohammad Bagher Zolgadar instantly took his place.
They just kept swapping them in.
Yeah, Zolgadar didn't have to invent a new system.
Yeah.
He just took the reins, solidifying the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' total control over the structure. They just kept swapping out the damaged parts.
Yeah. This highlights the massive intelligence paradox Dr. Novin focuses on. Sun Tzu's imperative is, know the enemy and know yourself. The U.S. and Israel had virtually perfect technical intelligence.
Down to the centimeter.
Right. They had the precise GPS coordinates of Khamenei's compound, the exact schedules of highly classified regime meetings, the blueprints of nuclear facilities. But their political intelligence, knowing how the regime would react, understanding their structural resilience, was conspicuously shallow.
Relying purely on technical intelligence without understanding the political landscape guarantees disastrous, unintended consequences.
And we saw that.
Clausewitz observed that many intelligence reports are contradictory, more are false, and most are uncertain. You could drop a bomb with pinpoint accuracy, but if you don't understand the societal shockwaves that bomb will create, you are operating entirely blind.
And operating blind led to horrific consequences on the ground, because while they had the coordinates for some meetings perfectly dialed in, the fog of war resulted in a U.S. strike on a girls' school in Manab.
Just a horrific mistake.
An estimated 170 people were killed, mostly children. It was an absolute tragedy. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni publicly condemned it as a massacre.
And that completely shifted the diplomatic reality.
It really did. That one technical error fundamentally complicated Western diplomatic positioning for weeks, isolating the U.S. from key European allies.
A perfect execution of a flawed strategy still results in a flawed outcome. The initial strike did not collapse the regime, despite the overwhelming force and technological precision.
So, having established that the regime didn't fold, we need to look at how they fought back.
Yeah.
How does an objectively weaker party, in terms of conventional military might, take on the world's greatest superpower without getting immediately annihilated?
They employ a strategy that international security scholar Robert A. Pape refers to as horizontal escalation. Instead of trying to fight a conventional force-on-force war, which Iran would lose in a matter of days, they deliberately widen the geometry of the conflict.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I view this as, geographic judo.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Thanks. Iran knew it couldn't win a fistfight in a phone booth against American stealth bombers, so it turned the entire globe into the wrestling mat.
To carry your judo metaphor forward in judo, you use your opponent's massive weight and momentum against them. The U.S. brought heavy carrier strike groups and massive regional infrastructure. So rather than returning fire locally, Iran externalized the conflict.
Right.
They used decentralized, pre-delegated authority, allowing their proxies to act independently while under bombardment. They launched salvos of ballistic missiles and drones at U.S. bases spread across the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, Oman, and Jordan.
And the outliers are what really show the staggering scale of this response. A drone hit the UK's Akrotiri military base all the way in Cyprus.
Which is wild.
It is. An Iranian ballistic missile entered Turkish airspace, which prompted NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte to invoke the alliance's mutual defense commitments.
And it went beyond land bases, too.
Yeah. The conflict even stretched deep into the Indian Ocean, where the USS Charlotte sank the Iranian Navy frigate Iris Dina far from the Persian Gulf.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is a textbook application of Clausewitz's dynamic conception of defense. Clausewitz argued that defense is not just sitting passively behind a wall, it is actually the stronger form of war when you actively absorb blows while bleeding the attacker's resources and political will.
So they were trying to bleed the U.S. dry.
Yes, Iran was transforming its military inferiority into strategic cost imposition. They weren't trying to defeat the U.S. military, they were testing American political endurance.
And they didn't just use missiles to test that endurance. They weaponized the global economy. They closed the Strait of Hormuz. I really want you, the listener, to think about the reality of that for a second.
It's massive.
That immediately disrupted 20% of the world's global oil trade. Think about what happens to the price of everything you buy, not just the gas in your car, but groceries, medicine, Amazon deliveries, when 20% of the world's oil gets trapped behind a military blockade overnight.
It ripples through everything.
Massive shipping lines were forced to reroute all the way around the tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to supply chains.
Sun Tzu emphasizes indirect pressure exactly for this reason. Iran created a scenario where every subsequent choice the U.S. made carried an exorbitant compounding cost.
Yeah.
The U.S. had to divert resources to enforce a blockade, seizing ships like the Tuska, which Tehran loudly claims was carrying medical supplies, further muddying the international optics. American military superiority was never in question. But translating that sheer power into a strategic outcome was completely neutralized by Iran's spiderweb strategy.
We have this massive web of conflict spanning from Cyprus to India, causing absolute havoc on the global economy. Let's talk about the mechanics of fighting this kind of war day in and day out.
The daily grind of it.
Yeah, the source digs into the sheer arithmetic of attrition, and the math is honestly startling.
Dr. Novin points out that the U.S. and Israel brought absolute, undeniable, conventional superiority to the table. We are talking about B-2 stealth bombers, B-1 Lancers, B-52s, hundreds of Tomahawk missiles, 2 entire carrier strike groups.
The heavy hitters.
It was the most concentrated American military force assembled in the region since the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
And over the course of 5 weeks, they hit more than 3,000 targets. They hammered the nuclear sites at Natanz, Fordo, Isfahan, and Bushehr. They hit naval assets and gas fields.
Just massive destruction.
And yet, despite all of that destruction, Iranian missile barrages just kept coming well into April. I mean, mechanically, how is that even possible under that level of bombardment?
It comes down to severe cost asymmetry. Analysts in the Foundation for Defense of Democracies flagged this exact vulnerability. Iran manufactures relatively cheap, mass-produced drones and ballistic missiles.
Okay.
To stop a $10,000 drone from hitting a command center, the U.S. and its allies are forced to fire highly expensive, technologically advanced interceptor missiles that cost millions of dollars each.
Wow, millions.
Yeah. The U.S. rapidly depleted significant missile inventories. Over time, the math of attrition simply does not favor the defender who is spending millions to shoot down thousands.
While the U.S. is burning through its most expensive munitions, who is sitting on the sidelines watching this happen? China and Russia.
Exactly.
The source cites an analysis from Foreign Affairs noting that Beijing and Moscow are perfectly content to sit back. They get to watch the United States exhaust its treasury, deplete its stockpiles, and bear the massive geopolitical blowback, all while they quietly preserve their own influence and economic ties in the region.
Sun Tzu warned about this phenomenon: strength misapplied becomes a weakness. If you possess massive superiority but you waste it on a strategy that fails to produce a durable outcome, that strength becomes strategically inert.
That makes a lot of sense.
You are essentially wearing yourself out doing the heavy lifting for your global competitors.
Dr. Novin also emphasizes that this 2026 war is the ultimate hybrid conflict. It's not just kinetic strikes happening in the physical world, it's happening everywhere simultaneously.
The cyber dimension was incredibly disruptive. Flashpoint documented simultaneous system-level disruptions that crippled civilian infrastructure. You had massive cyber attacks halting all flights at Dubai airports.
Just freezing travel.
Yeah. And Poland reported foiling a highly sophisticated cyber attack on its national nuclear center that had possible Iranian links. Hacktivist groups were constantly defacing government websites and launching DDoS attacks on financial institutions.
But it wasn't just digital code either. It was deeply psychological and religious information warfare. Grand Ayatollah Sistani issued a fatwa declaring a collective religious obligation for communal defense.
A huge move.
Right. That is an information operation that is arguably just as consequential as dropping a bomb on a runway. It instantly mobilizes an entire demographic across national borders, completely bypassing conventional military defenses.
It deliberately blurs the line between war and not war. The Center for Strategic and International Studies refers to this state as persistent competition.
What's fascinating here is the massive gap between the political framing back in Washington versus the reality on the ground. The source notes that on March 24th, President Trump publicly claimed that the U.S. and Israel had won the war.
Even though it wasn't over.
Right. The Iranian strikes were literally still continuing at that very moment. How do Clausewitz or Sun Tzu judge a victory when the bombs are still falling?
Clausewitz is entirely uncompromising on this point. Victory is not something a politician simply declares. It is a state that you achieve. And you only achieve it when you have successfully subordinated the enemy's political will, forcing them to accept your terms.
Which they hadn't done.
That clearly had not happened on March 24th. Sun Tzu might look at a prolonged, messy stalemate where neither side is entirely annihilated as a kind of mutual deterrence, a very indirect, ugly form of success.
But Clausewitz would vehemently disagree with that assessment.
Oh, absolutely. Clausewitz would view it as a profound failure of statecraft.
Yeah.
To him, without a political resolution, the war persists as a condition rather than an instrument. It ceases to be a tool used to build a new reality. It just becomes ongoing, expensive violence without a purpose.
So what does this all mean? Let's zoom out and look at the final picture Dr. Novin has painted of April 2026. On one hand, the U.S. and Israel achieved massive tactical successes.
Unprecedented stuff.
Yeah, they assassinated a supreme leader, which is historically unprecedented in modern great power conflict. They destroyed 2/3 of Iran's missile capacity. They successfully struck over 3,000 targets.
But they suffered from profound Clausewitzian incoherence. Because they had no clear, unified political objective guiding those strikes, all of that extraordinary tactical success ultimately led nowhere strategically.
Meanwhile, Iran suffered catastrophic physical and human losses. Thousands of civilians were killed, their critical infrastructure was reduced to ashes, and we can't forget their profound domestic fragility.
They were very vulnerable internally.
Exactly. The source points out that the regime was so unpopular internally that they massacred thousands of their own citizens during protests just a few months prior, in January 2026. The regime is highly fragile, yet they managed a strategic consistency that entirely frustrated the world's greatest military power.
They relentlessly adapted their leadership structure, they imposed crushing global economic costs by weaponizing the Strait of Hormuz, and they maintained their decentralized proxy networks under heavy fire.
They didn't just give up.
No, they didn't win in the classical sense either. They certainly didn't achieve domestic security or economic prosperity, but they survived by simply outlasting the incoherence of their adversaries.
That leaves us at the final status as of late April 2026. The result is not a resolution. It is a state of managed, wildly expensive instability. The Pakistan-brokered ceasefire is continuously violated by both sides. The global shipping lanes remain a tangled mess, driving up the cost of living globally.
It is the ultimate proof that war is not simply a contest of who possesses the most power. It is about the coherent, disciplined application of that power in service of a clearly defined purpose.
Right.
Without that discipline, you just generate chaos.
We come back to the house we were demolishing at the start of our deep dive. The U.S. swung the sledgehammer with incredible technological force and precision. But because they couldn't agree on a blueprint, they didn't build anything new.
Just rubble.
Yeah, they just created a very dangerous, very expensive pile of rubble that the rest of the world now has to live in.
A perfect, sobering encapsulation of the wages of incoherence.
I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over as you digest Dr. Novin's analysis. If the world's most advanced, heavily funded military forces can no longer guarantee a durable political resolution, even when they achieve overwhelming tactical superiority, do we need to fundamentally redefine what it means to be a global superpower?
That's a great question.
In an era where a cheaply manufactured drone and a closed shipping lane can bring the global economy to its knees, is conventional military might becoming obsolete? It is a question that military planners and all of us are going to be wrestling with for a long time. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning the narratives around global events. We'll see you next time.